The trucks rattled across the endless dirt road of South Texas red dust, swirling behind them like smoke from a dying fire. Inside the covered bed of the military transport, 6 Japanese women sat pressed together, shoulders touching, eyes cast downward. They had been traveling for 3 days from the temporary detention camp in California. 3 days without bathing. 3 days without changing clothes. 3 days without knowing where they were being taken. Yuki Tanaka was the last to climb down when the truck finally stopped. She was 22 years old, the youngest of the group, her thin prison uniform clinging to her skin with sweat and dust. Before the war, she had been a third-year nursing student at Kyoto University. She had dreamed of becoming a doctor of healing the sick, of making her mother proud. Now she was just a number in a military file, a prisoner being transported like cargo across an enemy nation. She paused at the edge of the truck bed, squinting against the blinding Texas sun. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her knees trembled beneath her. She had prepared herself for barbed wire fences. She had prepared herself for guard towers with mounted guns. She had prepared herself for shouting soldiers and snarling dogs. But there was none of that. Instead, she saw golden wheat fields stretching to the horizon like an ocean made of sunlight. She saw a white-painted farmhouse with a wide porch and rocking chairs. She saw a large red barn in the distance and a windmill turning lazily in the hot breeze. The air smelled of dry earth and hay and something sweet she could not identify. Not gunpowder, not blood, not the stench of the detention camp. This could not be a prison. And yet here she was, a prisoner of war, standing in the middle of what looked like paradise. The soldier escorting them pointed toward the farmhouse. His voice was flat, neither cruel nor kind. "Move," he said. That was all. Just one word. A figure emerged from the shadow of the porch. Thomas McAllister was tall, nearly 6 feet, with shoulders as wide as a barn door. His skin was the color of Texas clay, burned dark by decades under the unforgiving sun. A gray beard covered his jaw, thick and weathered, and his eyes were the blue-gray of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Yuki felt her stomach drop. This is the man who will kill us, she thought. This is the face of our executioner. But Tom McAllister did not shout. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply walked over to the escorting soldier and spoke in a low, measured voice. The words were foreign to Yuki, but she could read the language of his body. There was no aggression in his stance, no threat in his movements. He nodded slowly as the soldier spoke, his eyes drifting over each of the women in turn. Not with hatred, not with disgust, with something closer to exhaustion, or perhaps sorrow. When the soldier drove away, leaving them alone with the stranger, the silence felt heavier than any chains. Tom stood there for a long moment, looking at the 6 women huddled together like frightened birds. Then he turned and walked toward the barn, gesturing for them to follow. No commands, no shouting, just a simple wave of his hand. Yuki looked at Sachiko Yamamoto, the eldest of their group at 38. Sachiko had been an elementary school teacher in Osaka before the war. She was the only one among them who knew any English, though her knowledge was basic at best. Sachiko met Yuki's eyes and nodded slightly. "We follow her expression," said. "We have no other choice." They walked across the dusty yard toward the barn, their footsteps crunching on the dry Texas earth. The sun beat down on their necks. The wheat fields whispered in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. Yuki had never felt more terrified in her life. Inside the barn, the light was softer, filtered through gaps in the wooden walls. The air was cooler here, thick with the smell of dried hay and old wood. Yuki's eyes adjusted slowly, and she saw wooden buckets of water arranged on a long table, steam rising faintly from their surfaces. She froze. In the detention camp, they had been warned never to accept anything from the enemy. Water could be poisoned. Food could be a trap. Every kindness was a deception designed to weaken their resolve. Tom seemed to understand their hesitation. Without a word, he walked to the nearest bucket, picked up a tin cup, and dipped it into the water. He drank deeply, the water running down his chin and soaking into his gray beard. Then he set the cup down and stepped back. The message needed no translation. "I drink first. You see, it is safe." Yuki looked at Sachiko again. The older woman nodded. Yuki stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the cup. She lifted it to her lips and took a small sip. The water was cold, clean, alive. It was nothing like the murky, rust-tasting liquid they had been given in the camp. This was well water, pure and sweet, the kind of water she remembered from the mountain streams near Kyoto, where her family had picnicked when she was a child. She drank more and more, until the cup was empty and tears were streaming down her face. She did not know why she was crying. Perhaps it was relief. Perhaps it was confusion. Perhaps it was the overwhelming strangeness of being shown kindness by the enemy. One by one, the other women stepped forward to drink. They drank in silence, their eyes darting toward the barn door, half expecting soldiers to burst in at any moment. But no one came. There was only the sound of water being swallowed and the soft rustle of the wind through the wheat fields outside. After the water came bread. A woman appeared in the doorway of the barn. Eleanor McAllister was 54 years old, her brown hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was kind but tired, with deep lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy grief. She carried a wooden tray, and on it were thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. Beside the bread was a plate of thin sliced bacon, its edges crispy and glistening. The smell hit Yuki like a wave, sweet and smoky and rich. Nothing like the hard, stale crust they had been fed in the detention camp. This was real food. This was the smell of a home. Eleanor set the tray down on the table and stepped back without a word. Her eyes moved across the faces of the Japanese women, and for a moment Yuki thought she saw something flicker there. Pain, perhaps, or recognition of some shared suffering that crossed the boundaries of language and nation. Fumiko, a 27-year-old woman who had barely spoken since their capture, was the first to reach for the bacon. She lifted a piece to her mouth and chewed slowly. Her eyes closed. Her shoulders began to shake, and then she wept. Not from pain, not from fear, but from utter bewilderment. This was the opposite of everything she had been taught about Americans. Where was the cruelty? Where was the torture? Where was the monster she had been warned about? "Why are they feeding us this?" Fumiko whispered in Japanese, her voice cracking. "Why are they being kind?" Sachiko shook her head slowly. She had no answer. None of them did. Outside the barn, Tom McAllister stood watching through a gap in the wooden wall. He saw the women crying over bread and bacon, and something tightened in his chest. Lord have mercy, he thought. How scared must they be to weep over being fed? He remembered 1918. He remembered the German prisoners his unit had captured in the Argonne forest. He remembered their eyes, the same fear, the same distrust. He remembered a young German soldier, no more than 18, who had sobbed when given a loaf of bread. War does not change, Tom thought. Only the faces change. He turned and walked back toward the house, his shoulders slightly hunched, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with his age. That night, the women were led up a wooden ladder to a loft above the barn. Yuki climbed slowly, her muscles aching from days of travel, her mind still reeling from the strangeness of the day. When she reached the top, she stopped and stared. 6 straw mattresses had been arranged in neat rows across the wooden floor. Each mattress had a folded blanket at its foot. A small window let in the last light of the Texas sunset, painting the loft in shades of gold and amber. Yuki had not slept on a mattress since before her capture. In the detention camp, they had slept on concrete floors, packed together with dozens of other prisoners, woken every few hours by shouting guards or the cries of the sick. Keiko, a 30-year-old woman who rarely spoke, walked to one of the mattresses and knelt down. She touched the straw gently, as if afraid it might disappear. Then she began to cry. Not loud sobs, just quiet tears rolling down her cheeks as she stroked the blanket like it was something precious, something sacred. Eleanor appeared at the top of the ladder carrying a small oil lamp. She set it down on a wooden crate and looked at the crying woman. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she nodded just once and climbed back down. Yuki lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep. She stared at the wooden beams above her head, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new place. The creak of the barn settling, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the wheat fields. She thought of her mother in Kyoto. She thought of the last letter she had received before her capture. Her mother's handwriting, elegant and precise, filling the page with love and worry. My daughter, survive. No matter what happens, survive. Yuki whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible. They do not hate us. The words felt dangerous to believe, and yet for the first time in months they felt true. She closed her eyes and waited for sleep that would not come. Dawn arrived in Texas like a slow explosion of color, the horizon bleeding orange and red across the endless sky. Yuki woke to the sound of a rooster crowing somewhere nearby. Her body ached, but her mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. The first real sleep she had gotten since the war began. She climbed down from the loft to find Tom already waiting in the yard. He held farming tools in his weathered hands, sickles for cutting, burlap sacks for gathering, leather gloves worn soft by years of use. He did not speak. He simply gestured toward the wheat fields that stretched golden and endless under the morning sun. Sachiko translated in a low voice, "We work today." The women followed Tom out to the fields. The wheat was ready for harvest, the heavy heads bowing under their own weight, swaying in the gentle breeze, like waves on a golden sea. Yuki had never seen anything so beautiful. Back home, she had only known the small rice paddies that dotted the Japanese countryside. This was something else entirely. This was vastness beyond imagining. Tom knelt beside a row of wheat and demonstrated how to cut and gather. His movements were slow and deliberate, the rhythm of a man who had done this work his entire life. Cut low, gather the stalks, bind them together, move to the next row. His hands moved with the precision of long practice, like a dance passed down through generations. Yuki watched carefully and tried to imitate him, but her hands were clumsy. The sickle cut at the wrong angle. Wheat scattered everywhere instead of falling into neat bundles. She felt her face flush with shame. In Japan, clumsiness was a disgrace. She braced herself for the shouting, for the punishment that always followed failure. But instead of anger, Tom walked over and stood behind her. Gently, he placed his hands over hers and adjusted her grip on the sickle handle. His fingers were calloused and warm-rough from decades of labor. He smelled of tobacco and hay and something earthy that reminded her of the gardens back home. Yuki went rigid. This was the first time since her capture that a man had touched her without violence. In the detention camps, touching meant grabbing, pushing, striking. The guards had handled them like animals, shoving them into lines, yanking them by the arms when they moved too slowly. But this was different. This was teaching. This was guidance. Like this, Tom said, slowly, his voice low and patient, slow and easy. She did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning. When he stepped back, she tried again. This time the wheat fell exactly where it should. For a moment, just a moment, she forgot she was a prisoner. She forgot about the war, about the camps, about everything she had lost. There was only the rhythm of the sickle and the whisper of the wheat and the warmth of the Texas sun on her face. Something inside her began to thaw. They worked through the morning sweat, darkening their thin uniforms, the sun burning their necks and shoulders. But no one complained. The other farmers worked alongside them, not watching over them like guards, but laboring beside them as equals, sharing the weight of the harvest, sharing the exhaustion. At noon, a voice called them to rest beneath a great oak tree at the edge of the field. Its branches spread wide, offering shade that felt like mercy in the brutal heat. Tin cups of water were passed around, cold and sweet from the well, and the women drank until their hands stopped trembling. Lunch followed. Eleanor appeared with a basket covered by a checkered cloth. Inside were sandwiches made with thick sliced bread and something the women had never tasted before. Brisket. Texas brisket, smoked for 12 hours over mesquite wood until the meat was tender enough to fall apart at the touch. The smell was intoxicating, sweet and smoky, and impossibly rich, with a caramelized bark that glistened in the dappled sunlight. Beneath the oak tree, the women stared at the sandwiches as if they were made of gold. Eleanor gestured for them to eat first. The farmers waited, watching quietly, making no move toward the food until the women had taken their share. Yuki bit into the sandwich and nearly wept for the second time that day. The meat melted on her tongue. The smoke flavor filled her sinuses. The bread was soft and fresh, a perfect vessel for the rich, savory beef. She had never tasted anything like it. She had never imagined food could be this good. Around her, the other women ate in stunned silence. Tears streamed down Fumiko's face again. Even Sachiko, who had maintained her composure through everything, closed her eyes and let out a small sound of disbelief. This was not prison food. This was not the food of captivity. This was the food of welcome. Yuki looked across the field at Tom McAllister, who sat apart from the group, chewing slowly on his own sandwich. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, distant and thoughtful. She wondered what he was thinking. She wondered why he was doing this. She wondered if she would ever understand. The afternoon brought more work and more heat, but also something unexpected. A vehicle appeared at the end of the dirt road, a cloud of red dust announcing its arrival long before the engine sound reached their ears. An old Ford pickup truck skidded to a stop in front of the farmhouse. The man who stepped out was large and red-faced, his features twisted with barely contained rage. Earl Dawson was 45 years old. He owned a cattle ranch 5 miles down the road. He had known Tom McAllister for over 20 years. They had shared beers, played cards, helped each other through drought and flood and all the hardships that came with Texas farming. But today, Earl was not here as a friend. Tom. Earl bellowed, his voice carrying across the wheat fields like thunder. They told me, you got Japs living on your property. Yuki understood that word. Jap. She had heard it hundreds of times in the detention camps. It was always accompanied by a slap or a kick or a glob of spit. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up, muscles tensing, hands gripping the sickle handle tighter. Tom walked out from the barn, wiping his hands on his work pants. His expression was calm, but his jaw was set hard. Earl, he said, evenly, what brings you out here? What brings me out here? Earl stormed forward, pointing an accusing finger at the women in the field. Bobby died at Pearl Harbor, my little brother. And you got the people who killed him eating off your table, sleeping in your barn. The words hung in the air, heavy with grief and fury. Tom did not flinch. He stood there, a wall of weathered Texas granite, and let Earl's rage crash against him like waves against stone. Then he spoke, and his voice was different than before. Deeper, heavier, like it was being dragged up from somewhere far below the surface. William died at Guadalcanal, Earl. Earl stopped mid-stride. William, your boy. William, October of last year. 23 years old. Tom looked toward the wheat fields, but his eyes seemed to be focused on something much farther away. He wrote me a letter a week before he died, said he was scared, said he missed home, said he wanted to come back and help me with the harvest. Silence fell between them. The wind rustled through the wheat. Somewhere in the barn, a horse stomped nervously. I did not know, Earl said, his voice suddenly smaller. Tom, I did not know. You think I do not want someone to blame? Tom turned back to face Earl, and there was fire burning in those blue-gray eyes. You think I do not lie awake at night, wishing I could find someone to hate. But these women did not kill my boy Earl. They are civilians, nurses, teachers, farmers. They got caught in the same war that took William and Bobby and millions of others on both sides. Earl stood frozen, the anger draining from his face and leaving something emptier behind. War takes from all of us, Tom continued, stepping closer. But I refuse to let it take my humanity too. You can hate for the rest of your life if you want, but I choose different. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Earl turned without a word, climbed back into his truck, and drove away in a cloud of red dust. When the sound of the engine faded, Tom stood alone in the yard, his shoulders slumping slightly under an invisible weight. Eleanor emerged from the house and stood beside him. She did not speak. She simply placed her hand on his arm, and together they watched the dust settle on the empty road. Yuki watched from the edge of the wheat field, her heart pounding. She had not understood all the words, but she had understood enough. The man who owned this farm had lost his son in the same war, and yet here he was feeding them, sheltering them, defending them against his own neighbors. For the first time since her capture, Yuki began to believe that perhaps the world was not as simple as she had been taught. Perhaps enemies were not born, perhaps they were made, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could be unmade. That night, lying in the loft with moonlight streaming through the small window, Yuki made a decision. She would stop waiting for the cruelty to begin. She would stop bracing for the blow that never came. Instead, she would watch. She would learn. She would try to understand these strange people who treated their enemies with kindness. And maybe if she was very lucky, she would survive long enough to tell someone about it. Outside, the Texas wind swept across the wheat fields, carrying the scent of earth and hay, and something that might have been hope. The days settled into a rhythm that Yuki had not known was possible in wartime. Sunrise brought the soft glow of Texas dawn slipping through the cracks in the barn walls. Then came breakfast, always more generous than anything they had received in the detention camps. Bacon and eggs, biscuits with butter, strong black coffee that the women learned to drink despite its bitterness. then work in the fields until the sun climbed high and the heat became unbearable. Rest under the great oak tree, more work. Dinner as the sky turned orange and purple. Sleep in the loft with the blankets that smelled of lavender and cedar. It was not freedom, but it was not captivity either. It was something in between, something none of them had words for. Yuki found herself watching Tom McAllister more and more as the weeks passed. She studied the way he moved through his days, the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent his entire life working this land. She noticed how he never raised his voice, how he communicated more with gestures than words, how he seemed to carry an invisible weight on his shoulders that had nothing to do with the labor of farming. She learned that he woke before anyone else, that he spent the first hour of each day alone on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring out at the wheat fields as if searching for something he had lost. She learned that he kept a photograph in his shirt pocket, though she never saw him take it out. She learned that sometimes late at night she could hear him walking in the yard below his footsteps, slow and heavy with sleeplessness. She did not yet know about William. She did not yet understand that Tom McAllister was a man learning to live with a hole in his heart the size of a sun. But she sensed the grief. She recognized it because she carried her own. Sachiko became the bridge between their two worlds. Her English improved rapidly through daily conversations with Eleanor, and soon she was translating not just words but meanings, not just sentences but feelings. She taught the other women simple phrases. Good morning. Thank you. Please. Yes. No. The words felt strange in their mouths at first, foreign shapes that their tongues struggled to form. But slowly, gradually, they began to communicate. The first real conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in late August. Eleanor had brought out a small radio and placed it on the porch, turning the dial until soft country music filled the air. The melody was slow and mournful, a man singing about lost love and empty roads and the loneliness of the Texas plains. None of the women understood the lyrics, but music needs no translation. The sadness in the singer's voice was universal. Sachiko sat on the porch steps listening. After a moment, she began to hum along, not matching the American melody, but weaving around it with a Japanese lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. The two songs intertwined, different but not discordant, like two rivers flowing toward the same sea. Eleanor turned to look at her. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Eleanor reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small photograph. She held it out for Sachiko to see. William, she said softly. My son. Sachiko looked at the picture. A young man in a military uniform, blonde hair, wide smile, eyes full of the confidence of youth. Handsome, full of life, full of future. Gone. Sachiko did not need to ask what had happened. The black dress Eleanor sometimes wore on Sundays told the story. The way Tom sometimes stopped in the middle of work to stare at nothing told the story. The empty bedroom at the end of the hall told the story. I am sorry, Sachiko said slowly, carefully, the English words heavy on her tongue. Very sorry. Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening, but not spilling over. She had learned to hold her tears. She had learned that if she started crying, she might never stop. Do you have children? Eleanor asked. Sachiko shook her head. No children. But I was teacher. Many children. She paused, searching for words. War take them too. Not dead, but gone. Scattered, like leaves in wind. They sat together in silence as the country music played on two women from opposite sides of the world, sharing a grief that knew no borders. From inside the barn, Yuki watched through a crack in the wall. She saw Sachiko and Eleanor sitting together, saw their hands almost touching, saw the understanding passing between them without need for words. And she began to believe that perhaps peace was possible. Not the peace of treaties and surrenders, but the smaller peace that grows between human hearts. 2 weeks after the women arrived, a military jeep appeared at the end of the long dirt road. Captain James Crawford stepped out, his uniform crisp despite the Texas heat, his face carrying the expression of a man who had been given an unpleasant duty. Tom met him on the porch. Their handshake was firm but brief. Mr. McAllister, Crawford said in a voice that was all business. I have received a report concerning your treatment of the prisoners assigned to your property. Tom crossed his arms over his chest. And what does this report say? It says you are allowing them excessive freedoms, no guards, no restrictions on movement, eating meals with your family. Crawford glanced toward the barn where the women had retreated at the first sight of the military vehicle. There are concerns about security. Security. Tom repeated the word like it tasted sour in his mouth. These women are farmers and nurses, Captain, not soldiers. Where exactly are they going to run to Mexico is 100 miles south through open desert. The nearest town is 30 miles away. They would die of heat stroke before they got halfway to anywhere. Crawford shifted his weight uncomfortably. The report came from a local resident, a Mr. Earl Dawson. He is requesting that the prisoners be transferred to a different facility. Yuki pressed her face against the crack in the barn wall, straining to hear. She caught only fragments of the conversation, but she understood enough. Someone wanted them gone. The fragile safety they had found was being threatened. Tom's voice dropped lower, but somehow it carried more weight. Captain, I lost my son at Guadalcanal. William was 23 years old. He never had a chance to get married or have children or take over this farm. Crawford nodded slightly. I am aware of your loss, sir. Then you understand that I have every reason to hate those women. Tom pointed toward the barn. Every reason to treat them like the enemy they are supposed to be. But I choose not to. I choose to follow the Geneva Convention and treat them like human beings. Because if I do not, then my son died for nothing. He died fighting for a country that claims to believe in human dignity, and I will not dishonor his memory by becoming the monster that our enemies accused us of being. The captain stood very still. The Texas wind blew dust across the yard between them. I will note in my report that all protocols are being followed, Crawford said finally, but I will be required to make periodic inspections. Inspect all you want, Tom replied. I have nothing to hide. Crawford nodded once, returned to his jeep, and drove away without looking back. That night, Yuki learned from Sachiko what had been said. She lay awake for hours afterward, turning the words over in her mind. Tom McAllister had defended them. He had risked his reputation, possibly his freedom, to protect women who were supposed to be his enemies. She did not understand why, but she was beginning to want to. September brought cooler mornings and the first hints of autumn color in the leaves of the oak tree. The wheat harvest was nearly complete, the golden fields now reduced to stubble stretching toward the horizon. The women had grown stronger from the weeks of labor, their movements more confident, their fears slowly giving way to something closer to acceptance. One afternoon, Tom found Yuki alone in the yard washing vegetables for dinner. He stood there for a moment watching her work, then pulled something from his shirt pocket, a small paper envelope. He handed it to her without a word. Inside were seeds, tomato seeds, bean seeds, yellow chrysanthemum seeds. Yuki looked up at him confused. Tom pointed to a bare patch of earth near the corner of the barn. For you, he said slowly, making sure she understood. You plant. Your garden. Yuki stared at the seeds in her palm, small and insignificant looking. And yet they represented something enormous. This was not an order. This was not work assigned to a prisoner. This was a gift. This was trust. She felt tears prick at her eyes, but forced them back. In Japanese, showing too much emotion was a sign of weakness. But here in Texas, standing before this man who had every reason to hate her and chose not to, she found that the old rules no longer seemed to apply. Thank you, she managed in English. The words came out rough and awkward, but they were enough. Tom nodded once, the ghost of a smile crossing his weathered face, and walked away. That afternoon, Yuki knelt in the dirt and began to plant. She pressed each seed into the earth with her fingertips, the motion achingly familiar. She had done this with her mother 1,000 times in the small garden behind their house in Kyoto. She remembered the feel of the soil, the smell of the rain, the satisfaction of watching something grow from nothing. As she worked, the other women gathered to watch. One by one they knelt beside her and began helping. Sachiko, Fumiko, Keiko, Hanai, Michiko, Noriko. 7 women from a destroyed country planting seeds in the soil of their enemy, creating something new from the ashes of the old. When the last seed was buried, Yuki sat back and looked at the patch of turned earth. It did not look like much, just a square of brown dirt in the corner of a Texas farmyard. But to her, it was a beginning. The Harvest Festival came in early October, announced by a week of preparation that transformed the McAllister farm into something almost magical. Lanterns were hung from posts around the yard. Long wooden tables were set up in the shade of the great oak. Neighbors arrived from farms miles away, bringing dishes and drinks, and the kind of laughter that Yuki had not heard since before the war began. For the first time, the Japanese women were invited to sit at the same tables as the Americans. Not as prisoners, not as servants, as guests. Yuki felt dizzy with the strangeness of it all. The smells alone were overwhelming. Beef brisket that had been smoking since before dawn, the meat so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork. Chili con carne thick with beans and spices that made her eyes water. Cornbread fresh from the oven, golden and crumbly and sweet. Apple pie with a lattice crust, the filling bubbling with cinnamon and brown sugar. Pitchers of lemonade sweating in the afternoon heat. A barrel of cold beer that the men gathered around, their voices growing louder as the evening wore on. A fiddler began to play, joined by a man with a banjo, and the music rose into the cooling air like sparks from a fire. Children ran between the tables, shrieking with rot, their faces smeared with pie filling and barbecue sauce. A small boy approached Yuki. He could not have been more than 8 years old, with blonde hair the color of wheat and a face full of freckles. In his hands he held a slice of apple pie on a tin plate. He thrust it toward her, nervously waiting. Yuki took the plate and smiled. "Thank you," she said. The boy's face lit up like a sunrise. He ran back to his mother, shouting something joyful that Yuki could not understand but did not need to. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Eleanor appeared at Yuki's side. The older woman held out her hand. Dance. Yuki hesitated. She had never danced with an American. She had never imagined such a thing was possible. But Eleanor's hand remained extended, patient and unwavering. Yuki placed her hand in Eleanor's. They moved together across the dusty yard, their steps awkward and out of rhythm, neither of them knowing how to lead or follow. The music swirled around them. The lanterns swayed in the evening breeze. Red Texas dust rose beneath their feet like smoke from a fire that was finally burning out. Other women joined them, Sachiko dancing with a white-haired farm wife, Fumiko and Keiko spinning together, laughing for the first time in months, Hinai swaying with her eyes closed, lost in a memory of some happier time. In that moment under the Texas twilight, there were no enemies. There were no prisoners. There were only people broken and tired and grieving, trying to find joy in a world that had given them so many reasons for sorrow. Yuki looked around at the faces glowing in the lantern light. American faces, Japanese faces, all of them wearing the same expression. Relief, gratitude, something that might have been hope. She thought of what her mother had written in that final letter. Survive. No matter what happens, survive. She had survived. But now she was beginning to do something more. She was beginning to live. Winter came to Texas gently but persistently. The temperatures dropped. The fields lay fallow under gray skies. The work shifted from the outdoors to the barn and the house, mending tools and clothes and harnesses for the spring to come. Tom built a small wood stove in the corner of the loft to keep the women warm through the cold nights. He did not announce it or make a show of the effort. One evening it simply appeared, already stoked with burning mesquite wood, filling the loft with warmth and the sweet smell of smoke. Ellie brought up quilts she had made years ago for the son who would never use them. She did not say where they came from, but Yuki noticed the quality of the stitching, the care in the patterns, the love sewn into every seam. These were not quilts made for strangers. These were quilts made for family. They are giving us their sons' things, Yuki realized one night as she wrapped herself in one of the quilts. They are sharing their grief with us. The thought was almost too heavy to bear. December brought something unusual to South Texas: snow. Not much, just a dusting of white across the brown fields, enough to make the landscape look like something from a dream. The women woke to find the world transformed, and several of them went outside to touch the snow with their bare hands, marveling at the cold wetness of it. Yuki stood apart watching them play. She could not bring herself to join in the joy. Something heavy had settled in her chest over the past weeks, a growing dread that she could not name. That afternoon, a military courier arrived on horseback. He carried a bundle of letters from the Red Cross. Sachiko distributed them with trembling hands. For most of the women, there was nothing. No news from home, no word from families who might be alive or dead or scattered to the winds of war. But for Yuki, there was something. A single envelope, creased and dirty from its long journey across the Pacific. She recognized it immediately. It was her own handwriting. The letter she had sent to her mother 3 months ago, returned. Her fingers went numb as she took the envelope. She turned it over and saw the red stamp across the front. English words she had learned just well enough to understand. Deceased, returned to sender. The world stopped. She heard Sachiko asking her something, heard footsteps approaching, heard voices rising in concern. But all of it came from very far away, muffled by the roaring in her ears. "Mother," she whispered. "Mama." And then her knees gave way. Eleanor caught her before she hit the ground. Strong arms wrapped around her, lowering her gently to the wooden floor of the barn. Yuki clutched the returned letter to her chest as sobs tore through her body, sounds she did not recognize coming from her own throat. Her mother was dead. The last person in the world waiting for her was gone. She was utterly alone. The other women gathered around crying with her, even though the loss was not theirs. Sachiko held her hand and said nothing because there was nothing to say. That night, Tom climbed the ladder to the loft. He carried a cup of hot tea, steam rising in the cold air. He set it down beside Yuki without a word. She sat in the corner where she had been sitting for hours, the letter still clutched in her hands, her eyes swollen and red. Tom did not try to comfort her with words. He simply sat down nearby, giving her space but also presence. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then finally, Tom's rough voice broke the silence. "My boy," he said slowly, each word heavy with pain. "Before William left for the war, he told me something. He said if he did not come back, I had to keep living. Not for him, for the people who still needed me." Yuki looked up at him through her tears. Tom met her eyes, and she saw that his were wet too. "I think your mother would want to tell you the same thing." He did not say anything else. He did not need to. He climbed back down the ladder and left her alone with her grief. But somehow the weight of it felt slightly less crushing than before. She was not the only one who had lost. She was not the only one learning to carry an unbearable burden. And perhaps that was enough to keep going. The coldest night of the year came in January. Yuki woke to the sound of engines and shouting. She stumbled to the small window of the loft and looked down into the yard. 3 figures stood in the falling snow, illuminated by the headlights of a pickup truck. Earl Dawson and 2 other men from town. They carried torches and clubs, their faces red with alcohol and rage. "Tom McAllister." Earl bellowed, "Bring those Japs out here." Tom emerged from the house barefoot, despite the cold, wearing only his sleeping clothes. He walked down the porch steps and stood between Earl and the barn. "Go home, Earl. You are drunk." "Drunk," Earl staggered forward. "You are the one who is crazy, keeping them here like family, feeding them from your table, while Bobby rots in a grave in Hawaii." Yuki's heart pounded. She knew she should stay hidden. She knew she should let Tom handle this. But something had shifted inside her over the past months. She was tired of being afraid. She was tired of being silent. She climbed down from the loft and walked to the barn door. Sachiko grabbed her arm. "Yuki, no. Stay here." But Yuki shook her off and stepped out into the snow. Earl stopped mid-sentence when he saw her. A small Japanese woman, thin and shivering in the cold, standing alone in the yard. "My brother," Yuki said. Her voice was rough, her English imperfect, but the words came from somewhere deep inside. "Takeshi, dead. Philippines." Earl stared at her. "My mother." Yuki continued, her voice growing stronger despite the trembling. "Dead. Kyoto. American bombs." She put her hand over her heart. "I not kill your brother. War kill him. War kill all of us." The snow fell around them in silence. Earl stood frozen, the club hanging loose at his side. Eleanor emerged from the house and walked to stand beside Yuki. "We have all lost, Earl," she said quietly. "My William, your Bobby, her Takeshi. War does not care what side you are on. It just takes." Earl looked at Eleanor, then at Yuki, then at the ground. When he raised his head again, there were tears streaming down his face. He turned without a word and walked back to his truck. The engine started. The headlights swept across the yard one last time. And then he was gone, the sound of the motor fading into the snowy night. Yuki stood in the falling snow until she could no longer feel her feet. Eleanor draped a blanket over her shoulders and guided her back toward the barn. Brave Eleanor whispered, "You were very brave." But Yuki did not feel brave. She felt empty, hollow. Like all the fear and grief had been drained out of her, and there was nothing left inside. She climbed back up to the loft and sat in the corner with the returned letter still in her hands. The paper was worn soft now from all the time she had held it. The ink was smeared from her tears. She thought of her mother. She thought of Takeshi. She thought of everyone she had lost and would never see again. And she made a decision. On the last night of 1945, Yuki walked out into the snow alone. The yard was quiet. The house was dark. The only light came from the stars above and the thin crescent of the moon. She knelt in the snow beside the little garden she had planted months ago. The ground was frozen now, the seeds sleeping beneath the earth waiting for spring. But she dug anyway, using her bare hands to claw through the frost and the dirt until she had made a hole deep enough. She placed the letter inside. "Rest now, Mama," she whispered in Japanese. "I will keep living. Not because I want to forget you, because I want to live in a way that honors the love you gave me." She covered the letter with dirt and snow and pressed her palms flat against the frozen ground. Then she stood up and looked at the sky. The stars glittered like candles burning for everyone who had died. Her mother, her brother, William McAllister, Bobby Dawson, millions of others whose names would never be known. But Yuki was still here, still breathing, still alive. And tomorrow, for the first time since the war began, she would greet the new year not as a prisoner, but as a survivor. Spring returned to Texas like a whispered promise finally kept. The snow melted into streams that wound through the fields, and small green shoots began to push through the soil that Yuki had planted months before. Life, it seemed, had not given up on her yet. She stood in her garden on the first warm morning of March, her fingers tracing the new leaves that had emerged overnight. Tomato seedlings, bean sprouts, and there in the corner where she had buried her mother's letter, a single yellow chrysanthemum was beginning to bloom. She had planted that seed in grief. Now it was growing in hope. The months since that terrible night in January had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The raw wound of her mother's death had not healed, but it had begun to scar over. She could think of her mother now without feeling like she was drowning. She could remember Takeshi's smile without the memory cutting her like broken glass. She had learned to carry her losses instead of being crushed by them. Her English had improved dramatically through daily conversations with Eleanor. She could now speak in complete sentences, express complex thoughts, even make small jokes that sometimes earned a rare smile from Tom. She had learned to bake cornbread and fry bacon and make the thick black coffee that Americans seem to love so much. She had learned to ride a horse, to drive the wagon, to repair a broken fence. She had learned, most importantly, that home was not a place. Home was the people who treated you with kindness. The other women had transformed as well. Sachiko had become Eleanor's closest companion, the two of them spending hours on the porch discussing everything from cooking to philosophy to the mysterious ways of the human heart. Fumiko had discovered a talent for working with the horses, her gentle nature making even the most skittish animals calm in her presence. Keiko, who had barely spoken for months after her arrival now, sang Japanese folk songs while she worked her clear voice carrying across the fields like birdsong. They were still prisoners. The war was still raging somewhere far away. But here on this patch of Texas earth, something like peace had taken root. Tom McAllister watched the changes with quiet satisfaction. He never spoke much about what he observed, but Yuki caught him sometimes standing at the edge of the fields, looking at the women working alongside his farmhands, a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. One evening she found him on the porch staring at the sunset. "May I sit?" she asked. He nodded without turning. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sky turned from orange to purple to the deep blue of approaching night. The first stars began to appear, tiny points of light in the vast Texas darkness. "You have changed," Tom said finally. His voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who measured his words carefully. "When you first came here, you were like a rabbit caught in a trap, ready to die from fear alone." Yuki nodded slowly. "I was taught to expect monsters." "And what did you find?" She considered the question for a long moment. "I found people," she said at last, "just people, broken and sad and trying to do their best in a broken world." Tom turned to look at her, and she saw something shift in his eyes. Something like recognition. "That is what William would have said," he murmured. "My boy." He had a way of seeing people, not as enemies or friends, just as people. Yuki felt her throat tighten. "You must miss him very much. Every day." Tom looked back at the horizon. "Every single day. But having you here, having all of you here, it helps somehow. Like maybe his death was not completely meaningless. Like maybe some good can come from all this suffering." They sat in silence until the stars filled the sky, two people from opposite sides of a war finding common ground in their shared humanity. The news came over the radio on a hot August morning. Yuki was helping Eleanor in the kitchen when Tom burst through the door, his face pale beneath the Texas tan. "Ellie," he said, "the radio. Come quick." They gathered in the living room, all of them, the McAllisters and the 7 Japanese women crowded around the crackling radio as the announcer's voice filled the room with words that would change history. Hiroshima, a new type of bomb, destruction beyond imagination. Yuki felt the blood drain from her face. Hiroshima was not far from Kyoto. The people there, the families, the children. Gone in a flash of light, brighter than the sun. 3 days later, Nagasaki. And then finally the words they had been waiting years to hear. "Japan has surrendered. The war is over." The room erupted. The American farmhands whooped and hollered, throwing their hats in the air. Eleanor wept with relief, clutching Tom's arm. Outside church bells began to ring in the distant town, their sound carrying across the fields like a song of deliverance. But the Japanese women stood frozen. The war was over. Japan had lost. Their country, already devastated, had been dealt a final terrible blow. What would they find when they returned home? What was left to return to Yuki looked at Sachiko and saw her own fear reflected in the older woman's eyes. Going home had been their dream for so long. But now that it was possible, the dream felt more like a nightmare. The weeks that followed were strange and unsettled. The routine of farm life continued, but there was an undercurrent of tension that had not existed before. Everyone knew that changes were coming. No one knew exactly what those changes would look like. Captain Crawford returned in early September with official news. "The repatriation program has begun," he announced, standing stiffly in the McAllister living room. "All Japanese nationals currently held in labor programs will be processed for return to Japan. Transport ships are being arranged. You should be ready to leave within 6 weeks." 6 weeks. Yuki felt the words land in her stomach like stones. 6 weeks until she left this place. 6 weeks until she said goodbye to the people who had become something like family. 6 weeks until she faced whatever remained of her homeland. The days passed too quickly after that. Yuki threw herself into the work of the farm, trying to memorize every detail. The smell of the wheat fields in the morning sun. The taste of Eleanor's biscuits fresh from the oven. The sound of Tom's voice calling the horses. The feel of Texas dirt between her fingers as she tended her garden. She wanted to remember everything. She wanted to carry this place with her forever. Eleanor seemed to understand. She spent extra time teaching Yuki recipes, writing them down on cards in careful handwriting. Chili con carne, apple pie, cornbread with honey butter, Texas brisket with the special dry rub that had been in her family for generations. "So you will not forget us," Eleanor said, pressing the recipe cards into Yuki's hands. "So you will have a piece of Texas wherever you go." Yuki clutched the cards to her chest. "I could never forget," she whispered. Never. Tom's gift came a week before their departure. He found Yuki alone in her garden, kneeling among the flowers and vegetables she had grown from seeds. The chrysanthemums were in full bloom now, bright yellow against the brown Texas earth. "Got something for you," he said gruffly. He held out a small wooden box. Yuki took it with trembling hands and opened the lid. Inside was a hair comb made of polished wood, its surface carved with delicate patterns of flowers and leaves. It was clearly old, clearly precious, clearly something that had been loved for a very long time. "This was my wedding gift to Ellie," Tom said. 50 years ago, same comb my father gave my mother when they married." Yuki looked up at him, unable to speak. "William used to say he wanted a little sister." Tom's voice cracked slightly on his son's name. "Reckon if he was still here, he would want me to give this to you." The tears came then, impossible to stop. Yuki held the comb in both hands, feeling the weight of generations of McAllister love pressed into the smooth wood. "Thank you," she managed to say, "for everything, for teaching me that enemies do not exist, only people." Tom nodded, once his own eyes suspiciously bright. He turned and walked away without another word, his shoulders straight but his steps slow, like a man who knew he was saying goodbye to more than just a prisoner. He was saying goodbye to the daughter he never had. The last night came too quickly. They gathered in the McAllister living room for a final dinner together. Not a grand feast, just simple food shared by people who had come to care for each other. Chili and cornbread, apple pie, strong coffee, the tastes of Texas that Yuki would carry in her memory forever. After dinner, Sachiko stood and recited a haiku she had composed for the occasion. Golden wheat fields sway, Texas wind whispers softly, hearts become homeland. Eleanor wept openly. Even Tom wiped at his eyes with the back of his weathered hand. One by one, the Japanese women said their farewells. They bowed in the traditional way, deep and formal, but then Eleanor gathered each of them into an embrace that was entirely American, warm and tight and full of feeling. When Yuki's turn came, she found she could not speak. She simply held Eleanor for a long moment, breathing in the scent of flower and lavender that she had come to associate with safety and love. "Write to me," Eleanor whispered, "as soon as you have an address. Promise me." "I promise," Yuki whispered back. "I will write to you always." She turned to Tom, last of all. The tall Texan stood awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with emotional displays, but unwilling to let the moment pass without acknowledgement. Yuki bowed to him, the deepest bow of respect and gratitude she knew. Then, surprising both of them, she stepped forward and hugged him. "Thank you," she said against his chest, "for showing me that hatred is a choice, and that we can choose differently." Tom's arms came up slowly, returning the embrace, with the gentleness of a man holding something infinitely precious. "You take care of yourself," he said roughly. "And remember, you always got family in Texas." The morning of departure dawned gray and cool, the first hints of autumn creeping into the air. A military truck waited in the yard, engine idling, ready to carry the women to the processing center in San Antonio. Yuki climbed into the back of the truck, last her small bundle of possessions clutched in her arms. She turned to look at the farm one final time. Tom and Eleanor stood on the porch, arms around each other, watching. The farmhands had gathered in the yard to wave goodbye. Even the horses seemed to know something important was happening, standing still at the fence with their ears pricked forward. Yuki raised her hand in farewell. The truck began to move, rolling down the long dirt road that led away from the McAllister farm. Yuki kept her eyes fixed on the porch until the cloud of red dust obscured everything from view. She did not cry. She had no tears left. But she pressed her hand against her heart where she could feel the wooden comb tucked safely inside her dress, and she made herself a promise. She would never forget what she had learned here. She would never forget that kindness could survive even in the darkest times. She would never forget the family that had opened their hearts to an enemy and found a daughter instead. The journey home took 3 weeks. First, the processing center, where they were photographed and documented and given papers that officially restored their status as civilians. Then a train across the American Southwest, through deserts and mountains and cities that Yuki watched pass by with wondering eyes. Finally, a ship that carried them across the vast Pacific each day, bringing them closer to a homeland that existed now only in memory. Yuki stood at the railing as the coast of Japan appeared on the horizon. The other women gathered beside her, silent and tense, all of them wondering what awaited them on that distant shore. The Japan that emerged from the morning mist was not the Japan they had left. Yokohama Harbor was a ruin. Bombed-out buildings lined the waterfront. Cranes stood idle over mountains of rubble. The faces of the people on the dock were thin and exhausted, wearing the hollow look of those who had survived too much. Yuki walked down the gangplank on unsteady legs. She looked around at the devastation, searching for something familiar, finding nothing but destruction. No one had come to meet her. There was no one left to come. She made her way inland, following roads that were more memory than reality now. The villages she passed through were ghost towns, their populations scattered or dead. The fields lay fallow, untended, wild with weeds. When she finally reached the place where her family's home had stood, she found only rubble. The house was gone. The neighborhood was gone. Everything she had known was gone. But there, in the midst of the destruction, a single cherry tree still stood. It was the same tree that had grown in her family's garden since before she was born. The same tree she had climbed as a child, had sat beneath with her mother on spring afternoons, had watched her brother Takeshi carve his initials into one rainy summer. The war had taken everything else, but it had not taken the tree. And as Yuki stood there surrounded by ruins, she saw that the tree was beginning to bloom. Pink blossoms unfurled on its gnarled branches, delicate and defiant proof that life could persist even in the face of unimaginable loss. She fell to her knees beneath the cherry tree and wept. Not from despair, from gratitude, from wonder, from the impossible miracle of survival. She had lost everything, and yet she was still here, still breathing, still capable of seeing beauty in a devastated world. She reached into her dress and pulled out the wooden comb that Tom McAllister had given her. She held it in the dappled sunlight filtering through the cherry blossoms and made a decision. She would rebuild. Not just her life, but her capacity for hope. She would plant seeds in this ruined earth and tend them until they grew. She would carry forward the lessons she had learned on a Texas farm, the lessons of kindness and forgiveness and the stubborn persistence of human connection. She would honor her mother's final wish. She would survive. 6 months later, Yuki stood in a small garden beside a modest house she had built with her own hands. The plot of land had been granted to survivors by the local government, and she had worked from dawn to dusk to clear the rubble and prepare the soil. Now finally the garden was beginning to flourish. Tomatoes grew in neat rows, their red fruits glistening in the afternoon sun. Beans climbed wooden poles she had salvaged from the wreckage. And there in the corner, yellow chrysanthemums bloomed exactly as they had bloomed in Texas, a living bridge between two worlds. A letter had arrived that morning from America. Yuki kept it in her pocket, taking it out every few hours to read again, as if the words might change if she left them alone too long. Dearest Yuki, Eleanor had written in her careful handwriting. We think of you every day. Tom talks about you at dinner every night. He says you are the bravest person he ever met. And coming from a man who fought in France, that means something. The garden is still here waiting for you. Your chrysanthemums bloom every autumn, and I make sure to water them, just as you showed me. Tom says they are the prettiest flowers we ever grew on this farm. We hope you are safe. We hope you are well. We hope someday you will come back and visit the place that will always be your second home. With all our love, Eleanor. And Tom. Yuki pressed the letter against her heart and looked up at the sky. Clouds drifted lazily overhead, the same clouds that floated above Texas, the same clouds that connected all the people of the world, no matter how far apart they might be. She had found something she never expected to find in the land of her enemies. She had found family. 30 years passed. The world changed in ways that Yuki could never have imagined when she knelt planting seeds in Texas dirt. Japan rose from the ashes of defeat to become a modern nation. America and Japan became allies, then friends bound together by trade and culture and the shared memory of a war that had cost both sides so much. Yuki built a life from the ruins. She married a kind man who had also lost everything in the war. They raised 2 children who knew nothing of bombs and prisons, who grew up in peace and plenty, who thought of war as something from history books rather than living memory. But she never forgot the McAllister farm. She wrote letters to Eleanor every month for 30 years, chronicling the small details of her life, the growth of her children, the changing seasons in her garden. And Eleanor wrote back, filling page after page with news from Texas, with stories of harvests and grandchildren, and the slow, steady passage of time on the prairie. Tom died in 1970. He went peacefully in his sleep, Eleanor wrote. He was dreaming about William, I think. He had a smile on his face when I found him in the morning. Yuki wept when she received that letter. She wept for the man who had taught her that hatred was a choice. She wept for the father she had found in the land of her enemies. She wept for the loss of someone who had changed her life with a simple act of kindness. But there was one more chapter to be written. In 1976, a letter arrived that was different from all the others. Dearest Yuki, Eleanor wrote, I am 84 years old now. The doctors say I am healthy enough for one more adventure before I leave this world. Before Tom died, he made me promise something. He said I had to find you. He said I had to tell you in person that your garden is still here, that we never stopped tending it, that a piece of you has been growing in Texas all these years. I am coming to Japan. Please tell me where to find you. Yuki read the letter 3 times before she could believe it was real. The day Eleanor arrived was warm and bright, the kind of autumn day that makes the world feel full of possibility. Yuki stood at the Osaka airport, her heart pounding, with nervous anticipation, scanning every face that emerged from the arrival gate. And then she saw her. Eleanor McAllister was smaller than Yuki remembered, bent by age and the weight of years. Her hair was white now, her face lined with the map of a long life fully lived. But her eyes were the same, warm and kind and full of love. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers. Flowers grown from seeds that a young Japanese woman had planted in Texas soil more than 3 decades ago. For a moment, the two women simply stood there looking at each other across 30 years of separation. The airport crowds flowed around them like water around stones, but neither of them noticed. Then Yuki ran forward. They embraced in the middle of the terminal, two old women holding each other and weeping, oblivious to the stares of passing strangers. The years melted away. The distance dissolved. There was only this moment, this connection, this love that had survived war and ocean and time. The garden, Eleanor whispered into Yuki's ear. Your garden is still there. I have tended it every day since you left. Tom and I both did. We never let it die. Yuki pulled back to look at Eleanor's face, at the tears streaming down those weathered cheeks, at the smile that shone through the sorrow. You came all this way, Yuki said, her voice breaking. You came all this way to tell me about a garden. Eleanor shook her head. I came all this way to tell you something else. She took Yuki's hands in her own, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her age. I came to tell you that you are not alone, that you never were. That when Tom and I took you in, all those years ago, we did not just give you a place to stay. We gave you a place in our hearts. And nothing, not war or distance or time, can ever take that away. The flowers in Eleanor's arms released their fragrance into the air. Sweet and earthy and alive. The smell of Texas. The smell of home. Around them, people hurried to catch flights and meet loved ones caught up in the busy rush of their own lives. But Yuki and Eleanor stood still, two survivors of a terrible war, holding on to each other as if they might never let go, because they had learned something that many people never learn. They had learned that enemies are not born. They are made, and they can be unmade. They had learned that kindness is stronger than hatred, that compassion outlasts cruelty, that the seeds we plant in times of darkness can bloom into gardens of light. They had learned that family is not just the people who share your blood. Family is the people who choose to love you when the world gives them every reason not to. That night, in a small house in Japan, surrounded by a garden that echoed one far away in Texas, Eleanor and Yuki sat together and talked until dawn. They shared stories and memories and tears. They looked at photographs and letters and the small treasures they had kept across the decades. They laughed at old jokes and cried over old sorrows and marveled at the strange path that had brought them together. And when the sun rose on a new day, they walked out into Yuki's garden hand in hand. The chrysanthemums were blooming, yellow and bright and beautiful. The same flowers that bloomed in Texas. The same flowers that had connected two women across an ocean of difference. Tom would have loved this, Eleanor said softly. He always said those were the prettiest flowers on the whole farm. Yuki squeezed her hand. He is here, she said, in every bloom, in every seed, in every act of kindness that grows from the ones that came before. They stood together in the garden as the morning light spilled across the flowers, two women who had been enemies and become family, proof that the human heart is capable of miracles. The war had taken so much from both of them, but it had not taken their capacity for love. It had not taken their ability to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. Years later, after Eleanor had passed and Yuki herself had grown old, she would tell this story to her grandchildren. She would tell them about a farm in Texas and a family that chose kindness over hatred. She would tell them about a garden that grew in enemy soil and the flowers that bloomed across oceans. And she would tell them the most important lesson she had ever learned, that enemies do not exist. Only people, people who are afraid, people who are grieving, people who have been taught to hate, but also people who can learn, people who can change, people who can look at a stranger and see not a threat but a possibility. The war ended long ago. Tom and Eleanor and Sachiko and all the others have gone to their rest. But the gardens remain. In Texas and in Japan, the flowers still bloom every autumn, tended by new hands that carry forward the legacy of those who planted them. And somewhere in the space between nations, the seeds of kindness continue to grow. This is not just a story about war. It is a story about what comes after. It is a story about the choice that every person faces when confronted with an enemy. We can choose hatred. We can choose revenge. We can choose to let the cycle of violence continue forever. Or we can choose differently. We can offer water to the thirsty and bread to the hungry. We can plant seeds in hostile ground and trust them to grow. We can look at the face of our enemy and see our own reflection looking back. Tom McAllister made that choice on a hot summer day in 1944 when 6 frightened Japanese women stepped off a truck onto his farm. He did not know what would come of it. He only knew that he refused to let war take his humanity. And because of that choice, lives were changed. Hearts were healed. A family was formed across the widest divide imaginable. The next time you meet someone different from yourself, someone from another country or culture or background, remember this story. Remember Tom and Eleanor and Yuki. Remember the garden that grew in Texas and bloomed in Japan. Remember that kindness has no nationality, that compassion knows no borders, that the seeds we plant today will grow into the world of tomorrow. And choose wisely, because in the end, we are all just people trying to